I was actually really looking forward to coming to New York. I know it's a beautiful time of the year. We've been shrouded in smoke out here in the West. It's now starting to rain, which is a real blessing. So hopefully the fires go out and we stop sending smoke towards you. Let's see. I think should be going. There we go. I stole this slide from a friend during a presentation that he gave in Dubai about a decade ago. And I think it sort of underscores a couple of things that's changed during the nearly 30 years of work that I've done in food litigation and food safety. When I started out, it clearly the food system was much more US based, the food that we consume. One of the things that's really happened over the last, decades is that food is coming at us from all over the world. It creates unique challenges for the supply chain and, unique challenges for regulators, for food suppliers, food sellers, because not necessarily because food from overseas is less or more likely to be contaminated. In many respects, it's less likely to be contaminated, but it does create challenges both in monitoring it and if there's a problem for traceback. I prepared this next couple of slides less for people in the business, less for people in who regulate or who investigate foodborne illnesses. But I created this slide a lot for reporters who ask this question all the time when an outbreak is announced and they find out that the first illness was 30 or 60 days before the outbreak was announced. One of the things they always ask is, well, couldn't they have figured this out sooner? And I think what's really important to understand about how to investigate, how an investigation is done, is just how difficult it is, but really, really how important it is. So you have to have an ill person in order to start an investigation. And that ill person has to be ill enough to go to a healthcare provider. As we know, just looking at salmonella, the CDC estimates that for every one person who's got a positive specimen, there's 38.6 people who are uncounted in an outbreak. So that's a significant number of people who are ill, but usually don't seek a healthcare provider's care, and a specimen is not done. Finding the organism can always be a challenge, but really in order to understand a foodborne illness investigation, people really need to understand what the organism is. And a lot of that has to do, where I see it is, nearly everybody who contacts me feels like it's the last thing they ate that made them sick. And I think for people both in healthcare and in investigations, that's certainly people's understanding of, well, it's got to be the last thing I ate. But with incubation periods that could run from salmonella 12 to 72 hours, E. coli 1 to 10 days, Listeria up to 7 weeks, knowing what the organism is really helps understand what the likely source of the outbreak is. Once the organism is identified, the public health laboratory jumps in. Many times over the last decades, I've worked with the people at Wadsworth Labs to get information. New York is one of the, has been over the last decades, one of the top places in the country that does investigations really well. Once that public health laboratory gets that specimen, when I first started out, PFGE was sort of the standard. We're now seeing nearly uniformly across most public health entities the use of whole genome sequencing, which we could probably spend an entire day talking about just how incredibly useful whole genome sequencing is in both tracing illnesses, collecting what illnesses are related, and with giving a much more assurance that an outbreak is actually caused by a particular food item. Once the organism identified by the public lab, the epidemiological investigation, and this is really sort of the, shoe leather, getting people on the phone, finding out what receipts they have, what's the common denominator between perhaps people who have the same whole genome sequence, where have they been in the week, 10 days before they got sick. To me, finding out, what happened in the outbreak and doing the environmental investigation, getting the product off the market, getting that, doing that recall is certainly important. But to me, long term, it's knowing how this outbreak happened, at least to the best of our abilities. And then to be able to use that to, increase regulation or increase knowledge in the food sector to help avoid these problems. And we've seen great success over time. I started out doing mostly E. coli cases linked to hamburger, and from 93 to about 2000, almost all the cases I dealt with were E. coli cases linked to hamburger. And during that time frame, there were multiple outbreaks, multiple recalls, there were investigations, product tracebacks, all of that happened. And over that course of that time, industry and government learned what they could do to help prevent foodborne illnesses, and specifically E. coli cases linked to hamburger. Some of you who are as old as I am might even remember that HUS, hemolytic uremic syndrome, was called the hamburger disease. Well, you know what? After a decade of dealing with E. coli cases linked to hamburger, I only have one case in my office right now that's an E. coli case linked to hamburger. That just shows that these investigations, these environmental investigations, these tracebacks, the public-private partnerships, working together can solve a problem, and it's been really great to see. And I think that's true across all kinds of commodities. I'm going to sort of switch in a little bit to sort of what happens once the investigation occurs, and I'll give you a little primer about how the law actually works. That photograph maybe is a little concerning to many people. The real interesting thing is that that's a photograph, an actual photograph of a foodborne illness investigation. That food product is actually in a trunk of a car, but it's actually 30 degrees below zero. So it's, in many respects, it's probably one of the more safer places to store food than in the restaurant. So there's a couple of concepts, legal concepts, that I think are important for people to understand in the food space. The first is strict product liability, and it asks a couple of real key questions. Are you a manufacturer? Was the product unsafe, and did the product cause injury? A manufacturer is defined incredibly broadly, as if you really do anything to the product. If you change it in any way, if you turn romaine lettuce into a salad, you're a manufacturer. If you have your own private label on a food product, even if you didn't make that product, if your product's name is on that label, you see that in grocery stores and in restaurants, if you're going to be deemed a manufacturer. And then, was the product unsafe? And if a product contains a pathogen that can sicken or kill you, it is deemed unsafe. And then did the product cause injury? A lot of times people will call me and say they saw something in their food, but they didn't eat it, they didn't get sick. You have to have all three of these things in order to have a strict product liability lawsuit. Negligence is a little different concept, and it asks really, are you a product seller and did you act reasonably? The really good example of this is, going back, and I'll have some slides about the Odwalla outbreak soon. Odwalla was a manufacturer of unpasteurized juice sold on the West Coast in the late 90s. That product was sold in Starbucks. Starbucks opened up the jar of juice, poured it in a cup, sold it for $5 as kids' apple juice. In 1996, even though Starbucks was clearly a product seller, the real question I sort of struggled with back in those days was it unreasonable? Did they act reasonably? Was it unreasonable for them to sell unpasteurized juice to a kid? And at that time, I made the decision that it, wasn't unreasonable, that there was still, an increasing knowledge about whether or not how risky unpasteurized, especially unpasteurized apple juice might be. Today, I would have a completely different, feeling about that, and I would sue Starbucks in a heartbeat under the same set of circumstances. The other concept that I think is important to understand is punitive damages or criminal liability. Punitive damages are sort of focused on a company that knowingly disregards public safety. That's obviously a broad concept, but it's really, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about some examples that we've all known about. But punitive damages are there to punish somebody for consciously disregarding a known safety risk. Criminal liability, we've seen it rarely in food cases. We've seen it actually more frequently, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. It's usually at this time that a manufacturer, somebody will ask me from the audience, is that, strict liability seems really unfair. We do everything we can, and you're telling me that I can be sued if I try really, really hard and I do everything, the best that I can, but a product of mine that I manufactured gets out into the marketplace that's got E. coli or Listeria or Shigella or whatever in it, and I can be sued. And the answer is yes. If you're a manufacturer and the product's unsafe and it causes illness, wishful thinking just simply doesn't help. So I want to get a little bit into some cases that I dealt with over the last 20 plus years. Not so much to sort of tout what happened, but one of the things that I've learned over, nearly 30 years of doing this is true, like investigators, lawyers who show up to do these things, we have the unique ability to sort of second guess and look back in time. But one of the things that I've really learned over time is that when you do that, there's clearly moments in time before almost every single outbreak, and I have a hard time even thinking about an outbreak I've been involved in that didn't have an opportunity to have avoided it before the outbreak happened. And I'll give you some really good examples. In 1992, the state of Washington did a couple of things that were unique to states. It was one of the only states that had E. coli 015787 as a reportable bacterial illness. And the other thing it had made its food code change from 140 to 155 for the internal temperature of hamburger. And the reason why they had done that is they had had a couple of small hamburger-related taco outbreaks that were just a handful of people. But they realized that one of the things that they felt that restaurants should do is increase their cook temperature. So what Washington had is a couple of things that most states didn't. One is they had an increased cook time. The other, E. coli 0157, was reportable. They put that information out in early 1992 to all restaurants in the state of Washington and to all restaurant corporate headquarters that had franchises or restaurants in the state of Washington. So they were disseminating this information, through environmental health people who are in doing, trainings or in doing inspections in restaurants. They were telling, restaurants, hey, you need to pay attention to these new rules. Both, it was not only a rule for hamburger, but also a rule for chicken. And then this in the suggestion box. So one of the things that you love about litigation is the ability to get documents. In the suggestion box was a document that a customer or an employee of Jack in the Box could send to corporate headquarters. They had fax machines in each of the Jack in the Box restaurants in the state of Washington. And in June of 1992, so months before the outbreak, Wendy Conchinella, a shift leader at a Washington State Jack in the Box, sent this to corporate headquarters, described the change. I think regular patties should cook longer, they don't get done, and we have customer complaints. Describe the benefit. If we change this, we'll be making our burgers done and edible. What do you think Jack in the Box did? They wrote back to Wendy. Wendy, we'd like to acknowledge the time and effort you've taken to contribute to the success of Jack in the Box by enclosing this pen highlighter. Each person submitting suggestions is eligible to receive one gift per quarter with their first suggestion. I've always thought they should have made her a vice president. Then the question is this is July 24th, 1992. The outbreak was figured out in mid-January of 1993. What do you think Jack in the Box did? And the reality is what they did is they tried to see if they could make their hamburgers done and edible. They now for sure knew that Washington State had a 155 internal cook temperature requirement. The other 49 states was still 140. So the real question they had is sort of what do you do with that? And what they did is in their corporate headquarters, they tried to see if they could make their burgers done and edible and how to deal with this 155 internal temperature issue. And the reason I know that is that they dumped, tens of thousands of pages of documents on me, many of them somewhat blank pieces of paper with little squares with circles on them. And inside the circle were numbers like 130, 142, 155, 120. And finally, it dawned on me that what this was grills in their corporate headquarter restaurant, and they were trying to see if they could make their burgers hit the right temperature. And what they decided to do was after doing this investigation, and now this is August of 1992, they've researched the suggestion and determined with the variability of our grill temperatures, 350 to 400, that 2-minute cook time is appropriate. And what we learned was at 2-minute cook time at 400 degrees, they in fact did get the 155 temperature. The 350, not so much. And if there was an issue about new and old grills, some of the older grills, many of the older grills were cooking cooler. And so what was happening was, because 2-minute cook time, fast food, get that hamburger out the door, was more important than the internal temperature of that hamburger, that many restaurants, many of those in the state of Washington, many of those in the San Diego area, were older grills, and that hamburger became uncooked or undercooked. And again, this is August 24th, 1992. It is months before the outbreak. One little sort of factoid about the Jack in the Box case that many people don't know is the first part of this outbreak actually happened in California in November, December of 1992. And because California at the time did not have 015787 as a reportable disease, public health was flying blind. They weren't investigating these cluster of illnesses, including several kids with HUS and a death. And so that hamburger that was causing this problem in San Diego in November and December gets shipped to the state of Washington and to other Western states, but primarily the state of Washington in early January, which then exploded into an outbreak that took the lives of a total of 4 children. About 75 children developed acute kidney failure or hemolytic uremic syndrome, and there were about 600 illnesses. So when the Jack in the Box case was starting to wind down from 93 into 1996, we had resolved hundreds of cases with Jack in the Box. And I thought that I'd be going back to sort of doing, other lawyer things. And then the Odwalla case landed on my lap. Odwalla was my understanding is that they were purchased by Coca-Cola and the brand is being phased out now. But in in the early 90s, it was quite popular, unpasteurized juice, primarily on the West Coast, although it did get as far away as Colorado. They couldn't get too far away because the juice was unpasteurized, and they had a long history of these bottles exploding, which certainly could raise the issue about potential bacterial growth and contamination. What's interesting about this case is that this outbreak happened in November of 1996, and Odwalla had warnings that things were not quite right. They had reached out to the US Army to sell their juice on Army bases, and the Department of Army Veterinarian Command went to corporate headquarters and went to the manufacturing facility to check out the juice. And in August of 1996, they wrote back to Odwalla and says, "We reviewed the deficiencies noted in the report, which our inspector discussed with you at the time of the inspection. As a result, we determined that your plant sanitation program does not adequately assure product wholesomeness for military consumers. This lack of assurance prevents approval of your establishment as a source of supply for the armed forces at this time." You would think that if Odwalla can't sell their juice to the US Army because it has a lack of assurance of product wholesomeness, that they would maybe consider not selling it to pregnant women and children, but they kept, moving ahead. The outbreak happened, a little child died in Colorado. There were about a dozen kids with hemolytic uremic syndrome, some quite severe. We filed lawsuit against Odwalla. If I could get a response, I could ask you how many people think that Odwalla gave me these documents, and the answer would be they didn't. But because these cases tend to be highly public, we got a call over a weekend that said, make sure you get the US Army documents regarding Odwalla, click. And so we did a FOIA request on the US Army and received a number of documents. We then took these to the court and asked the judge to allow us to amend our complaint to add punitive damages, which the court allowed. And also the court ordered the seizing of Odwalla's hard drives, primarily, because they had not turned over these documents. One of the emails that I got, and we got lots, but one of the ones that sort of struck me was one from September of 1996, now 2 months before the outbreak. And this wording sort of, to me, is sort of chilling. It's not the vendor's criteria I'm concerned about. So, it's Odwalla's. Why are we doing it? Why now? What do we want to prove if the data is bad? What do we do about it? Once you create a body of data, it's subpoenable. You should look at this as though the Fresno Bee has looked into results and asked a lot of questions. what they were talking about was, now this is post being turned down by the US Army. What they're talking about is doing in-product testing to see if their juice was in fact fit for human consumption. And the decision was made, we're not going to test. We're just not going to do it, and we're just going to ship it. And 2 months later, this outbreak exploded. So, you know, are things different today? And for some of you might recognize these two gentlemen as Stuart Parnell and Sam Lightsey and the Peanut Corporation of America case. This is actually a hearing where, a congressional hearing. I was actually just almost right behind Stuart Parnell during these testimony where he took the Fifth Amendment. If you don't remember a little bit about this outbreak, the outbreak was really occurred from September 2008 through March 2009. Over 700 people were sickened. There were 9 deaths. The congressional hearings, this is a congressman from Oregon who held up this jar and to Mr. Parnell and said, "Will you eat out of this jar?" It was quite theatrical. But the thing that they had been in the plant and had gotten a bunch of emails about Parnell, turn them loose. Parnell ordered products identified as salmonella to be shipped, and quoting his complaints that tests discovering the contaminated food were costing us huge money. Here was the scheme that poisoned a bunch of people, killed 9, but what ultimately Stuart Parnell and the people who were charged were doing. Many of the manufacturers who were purchasing this peanut product from, they would turn it into crackers and put it into a variety of products. Those who might remember, this was one of the largest recalls of products ever. Almost 4,000 different kinds of products had this peanut product in it. And what was happening is there were vendors who said, you know, I need a certificate of that says that this product is clean, that this product doesn't have salmonella. And so Parnell would, and his people would send these products to a lab, and the lab would come back either negative or positive. And what they were doing is getting a lot of positives. So they were having to destroy product and not ship it. Then they had this idea, well, let's just get multiple tests from a lot and send it to multiple labs. And they did that, and some would be positive and some would be negative. They took the negative certificates and sent the product out the market. And then there were times where they were just getting all positive salmonella tests. Then they just started forging the results and shipping the product anyway. The product going out the door was the most important thing to Stuart Parnell and the people who worked for him. So ultimately there was a 76-count federal felony indictment. I'll talk a little bit more about the differences between felony and misdemeanor. But it was Stuart Parnell, his brother, Sam Lightsey, Mary Wilkerson, the former quality assurance manager, and Dan Kilgore. The allegations were mail fraud, wire fraud. So that was, you know, using the mail or using fax machines or telephones fraudulently. The introduction of adulterated and misbranded food into interstate commerce with intent to defraud or mislead. So they were being charged with felonies. Felonies under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act are punishable by up to 10 years in prison per count and $1 million fine per count. So you can do the math. You know, Stuart and the group were facing a lot. And then conspiracy. Ultimately, what happened was that Dan Kilgore pled guilty and testified against everyone. Sam Lightsey did the same just before trial. The trial went forward. Stuart Parnell, Michael Parnell, and Mary Wilkerson. Ultimately, Mary Wilkerson was found guilty on 5 counts. Michael Parnell on, it was 70 counts, and Stuart Parnell on all counts. Stuart Parnell and Michael Parnell each were sentenced to over 20 years in jail, and they're still in jail. Mary Wilkerson was 5 years, and she's just, my understanding is she's recently been released. So again, this is knowingly shipping contaminated product. It's with intent. And so that's the felony. So intentional acts are felony under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But what's interesting, and there's some examples recently of not necessarily requiring intent. These are pictures of, if you remember the cantaloupe Listeria outbreak, 33 people died, 148 people sick. You can be charged with a misdemeanor conviction under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but unlike a felony conviction, it doesn't require proof of intent. It's a strict liability crime. Essentially, if you manufacture and sell a product, especially across state lines, and even if you do not know that that product is contaminated, and even if it doesn't sicken people, you can be charged with a misdemeanor. And this misdemeanor is up to a year in jail and a $250,000 fine. So to me, this should be incredibly concerning, to anyone who produces food. And, for regulators trying to convince people why it's a bad idea to poison your customers, or to, why it's important to pay attention to food safety. To me, this is like really what you've got to pay attention to. And we've seen some recent examples of this. $25 million fine to Bluebell, a $17 million fine to Chipotle. We've seen, $11 million fine to ConAgra. We've seen multiple non-intent crimes being charged by the U.S. government. And I think that's, something that, I, was candidly surprised that there were prosecutions like this during this current administration, but there have been. And my sense is that, these are going to be things that are going to be more common. And I think it's a tool the FDA primarily and their Office of Criminal Investigation may well use. This Listeria outbreak was horrific, and 147 people, 28 states, 33 people died. I represented 30 of the families of people who died. This guy actually survived. Interesting guy. He's was a Russian refugee. He's actually still alive. He's 102 now, he survived being in the Gulag in Russia, and cantaloupe nearly killed him, but didn't. These are photographs of many of the people who were sick or died in this outbreak, and each one of these people had really unique stories. 3 of my clients fought in World War II. 2 of them had Purple Hearts for fighting in the Pacific Theater, and yet they come home, live a great life, and die from eating a cantaloupe. These are real people. So, again, where are we today? So far, and probably unclear as to whether or not COVID has had an impact, or whether or not there's been another leafy green outbreak this spring that has not been uncovered, but hopefully not. But in 1998, there were 240 people sickened. from Yuma-grown romaine lettuce, and there were 5 deaths. There were, countless numbers of people who developed, hemolytic uremic syndrome. I've had the, honor and privilege to represent most of the people who became seriously injured in this outbreak, and we've been involved in, the investigation. This was what the FDA, has produced and has not changed. Their, trace back, and as you'll see, everything is labeled point of service A, distribution center B. None of these things have actual names on it. One of the things that we have done is the points of service, restaurants or grocery stores. We have done the trace back and all the way to many times have been able to trace back to a farm. Sometimes it's tracing back to a farm is impossible because a distribution center has, bad paperwork that you can't figure out which product it used to put into its bag pre-processed salads. One of the real interesting things that we've uncovered is a connection between aerial spraying and certain farms that were clearly linked to this outbreak, and that aerial sprayer was using water from the Welton Mohawk Canal, which runs past a 100,000 cow feedlot in the Yuma area, and obviously, as far as you can see, are fresh fruits and vegetables being grown. To me, it doesn't take a rocket scientist. It doesn't take a really good lawyer to understand that there's an environmental component to this outbreak that isn't really being dealt with the way, in my view, the way it should be. As Elizabeth mentioned earlier, we were talking last night about a case that I'm involved in South Africa. Many people don't know about it, but it's the largest Listeria outbreak ever recorded. The latest count was actually 1,008 cases. There were over 200 deaths. That's not counting, fetal deaths. And it was just a terrible outbreak. One of the things that's really important to understand is they did a lot of whole genome sequencing, and we're doing that during the course of 2017 and finding, a lot of Listeria cases. One of the things that they didn't have was Listeria as a reportable disease until late 2017 in December. And once they had that as a reportable disease, and health officials were actually interviewing people, finding out what the common denominator was, they quickly found out early in that investigation that it was this product called polony from a company called Tiger Brands. It's a meat product that is common and consumed by white and black, rich and poor throughout South Africa. Once they did that recall, you can see the numbers of illnesses, drop like a stone. So I've got some slides sort of at the end here, and I'm looking forward to answering whatever questions people have or comments. Some things that I've learned over time that I think are important for manufacturers of food, sellers of food, and regulators of those individuals. Some real simple concepts, HACCP. HACCP to me is much more than just having a HACCP plan. It's just sort of having, it's a way of thinking. It's like, what are the things in my production facility? What is it about my business that could cause a problem? And what can I do to prevent that and document that I'm actually doing something to prevent that? having qualified and committed people to food safety in your organization, a lot of that has to do with people at the top being committed to food safety. My frenemy, Frank Yanis, who's now at FDA, was at Walmart for years. He and I teach a class, a graduate class together every year at Michigan State University. And he is very big on what's the culture of the food production manufacturer facility. Do they have a culture of food safety? And again, that culture comes from the top. Another thing, and just sort of dovetails back into my slide of my apple showing the world, it's, manufacturing products, especially that have a long tail that may go completely overseas for those products, they're vulnerable to many stages along that production line where, a contamination event can occur. So, a manufacturer needs to involve, both their vendors and their suppliers in food safety to try to convince everyone that it's a shared, a shared responsibility, that food safety is a shared responsibility. I'm throwing a bone to my friends in regulators. The reality is that people who regulate for a living don't view themselves as sort of the food police. They view themselves as educators, and their job is to educate you so you don't have to deal with somebody like me. You don't have to deal with an ill employee or a customer, or you don't have to deal, with the bad publicity that might come from a foodborne illness outbreak or litigation. So the things that I tell companies in the end is, you can ensure the brand's and the company's reputation, by, arming themselves with good current information, paying attention to details, looking for those things, kind of as a cultural thing, looking for those warning flags that pop up. It's like asking yourself, if you're the jack-in-the-box person, why would Washington increase their cook time to 155? What's the purpose behind that? And do I have the culture in my business to go to my boss and say, hey, the reason why they're doing this is because they're worried about, E. coli and hamburger, and you know what? We sell a lot of hamburgers. We probably should pay attention to this. Or Odwalla, if you can't sell your juice to the U.S. Army, again, maybe that's some kind of introspection, again, months before an outbreak, that you should ask yourself, gee, maybe we should be doing something a little different. I think having the choice between being proactive or just doing nothing, is just not an option in food safety. You need to always be thinking about that next thing, that new bug, a new technology, a new intervention. What can we do to make our products safer? And I think the other thing too is, we misuse the farm to fork idea. But again, I think the concept is really good. I mean, it's a shared responsibility. It's a shared responsibility to consumers, but consumers need good information. And just simply saying, well, they should have cooked it is a little different than understanding how sometimes the message that we send to consumers is that our products are so safe, don't worry about things. It's triple washed, it's whatever. And so sometimes I think consumers can be a bit confused about what that is, that their responsibility. I think more education of consumers, more education of the entire chain of distribution is important. I sent Barb some boxes, or a box of books about the Jack in the Box case that I think is always a really good read. I think it's a cautionary tale. about how, a good company can, do some bad things and, nearly, go to their knees. And it's also, I think, good to understand what can happen to people and what can happen to some of these families and how devastating it is. I'm working on a case right now where a 2-year-old boy, ate a little bit of romaine lettuce, and he's now, brain injured. He can't walk, can't talk, can't feed himself, and his kidneys are failing. And I just think about, how avoidable some of these things can be, or how at least we should try to avoid them. Because, they can hire me, I can get them every dollar in the world, but it's never gonna make that kid's life, okay. And so, I commend everybody for getting up early, at least me getting up early and paying attention. And if there's certainly any questions that I can answer, I'm happy to do so. And with that, I'll stop sharing my slide.
Hey, thank you very much, Bill. I'm going to start sharing my slide so that everybody can see the QR code. You all should be able to see that now, hopefully, so you can use that. As a reminder, put your questions in the Q&A box. We do have one queued up, so I'm going to go ahead and read that in case anybody's joining by phone. Due to COVID, there's a lot of people looking for jobs, and it's hard during the hiring process to determine whether or not people you are hiring are food safety minded. Do you have any suggestions on how to educate these people right from the beginning on how important food safety needs to be?
One thing you should, you could do is there, Marler Clark has a Vimeo page with a lot of videos of clients of ours who've been sickened or died from food. I think maybe showing a few of those videos might heighten people's awareness of how important foodborne illnesses are. I think many respects, people who serve, people who cook, people who clean don't necessarily connect the dots between what they do and how important it is what they do to the consumer. And I think, trying to explain to them just how important they are to the team and to the approach of food safety is probably the best thing you can do.
Okay, I'm busily typing a summary of what you just said, so it's documented both on video and in the notes. I don't see another question. I do have a question, and I thought you did a great, you mentioned early on about people think it's the last thing they ate, importance of, reportable diseases, importance of people doing what they can. I work with produce growers, and produce growers, the cantaloupe outbreak is an interesting one because I think they went to that piece of machinery to get away from a dump tank, right, where infiltration was more likely to happen. And doing that actually caused the problem. Exactly. So, what advice do you have to growers who grow products that have no kill step? Like the hamburgers are pretty clear, like you have a kill step, but fresh produce doesn't have a kill step. So would you like to comment on those kind of things? And especially, again, in the case of the cantaloupe growers, I think they were trying to avoid something that science had pointed out as risky, but they hadn't quite thought through their next step, right? They didn't realize the trouble they were getting themselves into.
Yeah, I mean, specifically with respect to the cantaloupe growers, they moved away from a dunk tank that had a chlorine in it to these brushes. It was actually a potato washing machine that they were using essentially tap water with no antimicrobial of any sort. And so basically, once those brushes became contaminated with Listeria, the cantaloupes that were going through there were basically being brushed with Listeria water. And so, but yeah, that company, these two young men were trying to move from conventional to organic because they had convinced themselves, and true or not, that their father had died of cancer because of the use of chemicals and pesticides on their farm over a long period of time. So they were trying to do the right thing, and they paid attention to an auditor who had made this suggestion, and it's obviously didn't turn out very well. It's a challenge. Food manufacturers, frankly, whether or not they have a kill step or they don't have a kill step, food manufacturing is a challenge with bacteria that has changed over time. I mean, 40 years ago, we weren't talking about 0157. 10 years ago, we weren't talking about some antibiotic resistant salmonellas. Listeria, is a bug that has grown up alongside human refrigeration. A lot of times you don't necessarily think through all the processes that come into production of food. But specifically with respect to produce growers, there's not a great answer. You cannot prevent all contamination, but just because you can't prevent all contamination doesn't mean you sort of throw your hands up and say, there's nothing I can do about it. Though I'm going to sicken somebody and Marler's going to sue me anyway. You go back and look at that slide of Yuma, Arizona, and ask yourself the question, is it a really good idea to grow a ready-to-eat or product or near ready-to-eat product within a stone's throw of 100,000 cows? So I think when you're growing products that don't have a kill step, you have to pay a lot more attention to where you grow it, how you grow it, what your inputs are, and then how you're processing that product to get to the consumer, and what information you're giving to the consumer or the product seller about shelf life and all of that. It's a complex thing, but and this is not necessarily a condemnation of processed foods per se, but I always think back on the 2006 spinach outbreak. 205 people sick, 5 dead. It was ultimately linked to about a 20-acre in process of going organic farm that spinach was all harvested on one day and sent to a processing facility where they washed and bagged it and shipped it across the country. 2 things that we know: there was wild pig intrusion in the field, but the little pigs didn't poop on every single lettuce leaf, but the way it was harvested and the way it was processed amplified that problem. Had you cut that spinach the way we used to see spinach in grocery stores in bunches, and would there have been a couple of illnesses? Maybe. There wouldn't have been 205, and there wouldn't have been 5 deaths. And if you look at also where those illnesses occurred, over 3/4 of those illnesses occurred in the Midwest and East after that product was shipped for days, in refrigerated containers for sure, but still shipped for days. So all of that, I think, has to kind of weigh on, producers of products that don't have a kill step. It's not impossible, still could cause a problem, but there are things you can do for your own HACCP plan to prevent these illnesses from occurring.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's I think too, using your head about having knowledge and using the knowledge, right? What are the choices you're making? I think that's a very good point. We have a couple more questions. This is from George. Have you seen any trends between companies that have had large food safety incidents and also lacked QA leaders?
I was trying to remember which outbreak this was. It's nothing against people with bachelor's degrees in fine arts. But I remember taking the deposition of the QA person it was a company that made a variety of Mexican food, and they had an outbreak of Shigella linked to 7-layer bean dip. It was like you could buy it at Costco. And they had a Shigella outbreak. Ultimately, it was linked to likely linked to the fact that they had non-functioning bathrooms on the production room floor that people were using anyway. But the QA person had a degree in fine arts and didn't even know what Shigella was as a bacteria. Not everyone needs to have a microbiologist on staff, but they need to, the people in positions of authority, especially as it relates to QA, need to pay attention to at least have some understanding of the risks they face. Sometimes the other thing that I've seen is that, food safety or QA is an afterthought. Maybe somebody out of marketing has gone over there. I think the companies that do best are the ones where QA has a direct line of communication with the top person, whether that be at a small company, a large company. That again, it's the CEO, it's that president who sets that tone, that he or she says, food quality, food safety is important to me. If you have a problem, if you know about a new regulation for Washington State that says you're cooking to 155, or that the military won't buy our Jews, that information should go directly to a person in authority, a person who can make that decision right away. And so, yeah, I've certainly seen where QA has been an afterthought.
Okay, again, I hope you're fine with me trying to summarize this.
Yeah, I know. I'm a lawyer. I talk too fast. I apologize. So.
Yeah, no, it's good. I think it's just, I typed the answer and then it disappeared. So all that work gone down the drain.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, there it went. I have another question. Okay, This is from Darren. Any thoughts on the impact of food safety with the continued increase in global movement of food?
Yeah, I spoke to that earlier. I think it's an ongoing challenge. I have visited a lot of food facilities, manufacturing facilities all over the world. Some of them, many of them that I've been to are far superior than to some of the facilities that I have gotten court orders to go into here in the United States after an outbreak. But again, the more complex, it's just like everything in life. The more complex you make your own life, the more likely it is you're going to make a mistake. And again, I think that's, unless you have systems in place that help you, if you're a super busy person and you don't have a calendar, or you don't know when the Zoom meeting is, that's probably a problem. And I think that's the same kind of, at least my thought process, is as you increase that tail of food production and products coming into you, you've got to also, increase, the awareness of those people who are supplying it. Do they have the same feelings about food safety that you do? Is it a priority to them? Or are they a peanut corporation of America? Just get the product out the door and, let's make our profit. Kellogg's made those little crackers that, wind up in vending machines at have a shelf life of, 10,000 years. Those products were one of the main reasons for the outbreak in the Peanut Corporation of America. They trusted that vendor. They trusted that the certificates of analysis that they were getting were not fraudulent, but they never had visited the plant. They never really audited that plant. They just trusted them. And again, like a former president said, trust but verify. And I think that probably bodes well, especially for manufacturers and product sellers.
Okay, and we're going to go with one, at least one last question. We're close to your finishing time. Has whole genome sequencing assisted in clarifying the burden of proof and decreased case litigation times?
So the answer is, whole genome sequencing gives you a much clearer understanding of what's a case and what's not a case. Is it within, 1 to 4 alleles or 1 to 20 alleles? And it's given a sense also of the family tree of some of these bugs, especially like the leafy green outbreaks in California and Arizona, and how some of them are connected to each other, at least from a whole genome family tree point of view. So I think the certainty of whether someone's a case or not has been, helpful. And I think has been helpful for us, because when we approach our cases, we only push forward cases that we know to be, in fact, legitimate. I don't know if it's changed dramatically from our approach with PFG. I just think it's given a sort of a higher level of certainty. There haven't been very many court cases where whole genome sequencing has been an issue. Early in my career, we dealt with, courts pondering whether or not PFG was scientifically rigorous enough. We haven't had that situation yet with whole genome sequencing. I don't anticipate it to be a problem. And I think long term, it's actually been, helpful in deciding what's a case and what's not. Whether or not it's brought cases quicker, I think in some products it has. I was involved in a Listeria cheese outbreak in New York a few years ago. That case ended really fairly quickly because of the work that the Department of Health had done and the whole genome sequencing and finding the product that it tested positive. And so it was kind of wrapped up very nicely. The leafy green outbreaks have been still problematic, primarily because you lose so much visibility once you hit a processing facility that might have 5 or 6 or 10 growers sending product on that same time frame. So knowing, even if you know the whole genome sequence, knowing where it came from is sometimes very problematic. So there's always, there's always something in these cases. I don't think we've gotten to the point where if you're a whole genome sequence match to a product, I still think it's important that you show that you actually consumed or became in somehow contact with the product or somebody who, ate the product. So I think that's still important. But I think overall, it is the way it's going to be. And I think whole genome sequence is a net benefit, to give everyone assurance of what the facts really are. And I think that's important.
All right. I want to thank you on behalf of all of us, Mr. Marler, for that great presentation. You will be back
will.
after the break for a panel discussion later this afternoon. So please, if you guys keep thinking about what he said and come up with additional questions, we will have time with him this afternoon during the panel discussion to ask more questions.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, people can always reach out to me. I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. So if you do have questions, anybody, please don't hesitate to send me an email or pick up the phone and give me a call.